Thank you, Stacey. And next we have Lexi Diosis, who will be giving a presentation launch of the draft Eco-Mobility and Clean Energy Public Transportation Policy. And afterwards, we'll have some time for a brief discussion before we close.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction on one day. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
The slides.
Yes.
Okay, lovely, cool. So like Awana said, my name is Lexi. I've been working on developing this, the eco-mobility and clean energy public transport alternatives, both the research behind this policy framework and then this policy framework that is a draft and is being launched today. So I'm curious to hear your feedback and also hope that you will engage with it. Before we get into there we go. Before we get into the policy framework, just really quickly, I want to situate what are transportation emissions and where do they come from? So there's two main drivers. The first is population growth that drives emissions from passenger transport. This is primarily through cars and to some degree through public transportation, but mostly through road passenger vehicles. And then also economic growth, and this comes from non-passenger transport. So that's rail freight, ships, and trucking. Globally, transportation makes up about a quarter of emissions. In South Africa, it's 10% of the total emissions contribution. At a global level, it's 91% dependent on oil, so it's very fossil fuel intense. Globally, 92% of those of the total transport emissions come from passenger road cars, and in South Africa, it's all road vehicles, so that's passenger and non-passenger. So that's private vehicles as well as trucks that are moving goods and freight all over the roads. It's also the fastest growing sector of emissions, and it's on track to intensify, making its decarbonization very important. So through a very large literature review and a policy scan, looking at what other countries are doing, looking at what the context is in South Africa, and basically what needs to happen in order to mobilize a progressive and a democratic and a sustainable transport system. These are four of the key systemic interventions that are kind of framing the rest of this transport policy framework. So the first is to decouple or separate population growth from transportation emissions through eco-mobility approaches, walking and cycling. Population growth can only be, passenger transport emissions can only be separated from population growth through walking and cycling. It's basically the only long-term approach that allows for those emissions from passengers to actually decrease over time. This can happen through policy, through infrastructure changes, through a paradigm shift or a change in thinking and how we think about who has a right to use what on the road. The second key systemic intervention is a rapid decarbonization of existing public transport systems through renewable energy approaches. So this is powering railway systems through solar, through wind energy. There's also a lot of room to explore cleaner fuels such as hydrogen. And this can happen and be mobilized through policy changes, definitely has to happen through infrastructure, but also a systems approach to thinking about renewable energy and public transportation and actually coupling this development. And then also technology development, both preferably in country. So there's opportunities to capture emerging renewable technology such as electric buses, electric trains, and also cleaner fuel trains. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of exploration going into hydrogen trains. There's also some exploration going into battery trains, as well as other technologies such as wave and electric boats. So there's room there for research and development. And then the third systemic intervention is an immediate shift of passenger and freight transport from road to rail. Building off of what I just said, that 92% of emissions come from road transport in this country. It is absolutely imperative that that transportation shifts over to rail. It's much more sustainable in the long term. It's much more feasible for infrastructure, and it also provides actually for a lot more jobs over the long term. This can happen through policy, through infrastructure, institutional reforms within PROSA and Transnet, and then incentive schemes, and also some bans as well to leverage that, to mobilize that shift. And then lastly, robust engagement with taxi associations and a very, very clear and consistent formalization agenda has got to unfold. So again, policy can shape that, but there has to be very consistent and meaningful stakeholder engagement. Incentives can help facilitate this. And we've also done some research and put some thinking into a kind of a cooperative model that I share a bit more on later. So we've broken up the policy framework into 3 different main roles. There's the role of government, the role of communities, and the role of workplaces and sectors. Arguably, the government, when it comes to the transport sector, has one of the largest and most strategic roles to play in facilitating this transition. So in the actual policy framework document, there's much more in terms of underneath each of these little subheadings, such as bans and disincentives. What I've pulled out here are just examples, so I hope that you read that and really engage with it. But just to give, I guess, kind of a flavor of what's in that document, when it comes to some policy tools that can be mobilized, there are bans and disincentives and also incentive schemes. These are meant to facilitate behavior change. So some of these things can be like tolls and fuel levies for trucks on national highways. Can ban tax incentives such as tax credits for purchasing private vehicles. We can change frequent flyer incentives such as these frequent flyer programs that actually reward you for flying more into frequent flyer taxes, and this should be targeted at the wealthy, not 80% of the world's population who's never flown before, but the 20% that's responsible for most aviation emissions. A ban on private jets or heavily tax them and then mobilize those funds into this policy framework and into financing this transition. Can also ban the sales of new internal combustion vehicles by 2030. And I put a question mark there because this is something that's happening as a global trend, but I do think it's worth, really worth critically thinking about and engaging with. And so I'm also curious what others have to hear. And the reason is that in a lot of countries where this is happening, the plan rests on assumption that electric vehicles can basically take their place. And that's not a priority for the climate justice charter movement for a number of reasons that I'll outline a bit later on. But just to say that that's, that this is what the CJC is putting forward and is building, but also that all of these are up for debate and engagement. So incentive schemes, again, these are just a few examples, but rather than having tax credits for purchasing private vehicles, mobilize these into purchasing bicycles that are used for commuting, and also including electric bikes. And then also setting procurement targets, initially for government institutions, but to procure clean energy buses and other mass transport technologies on a regular basis. A lot of other countries in the world have done this on a yearly basis, but to act as also like an implementation strategy to say, we're going to do this and this is how. And you can also use incentives to make these more affordable. So there's other levers here that are also involved in the government's role. Infrastructure probably this is like the biggest lever in terms of facilitating behaviors and lifestyles and actually creating a coherent public transportation system. A lot of this has to do with spatial and land use planning. It has to do with developments. But some of the trends that we're trying to encourage and the spaces that we're trying to create are highly walkable spaces, cyclable spaces. So, and a lot of places this has looked like car-free city centers, car-free streets. Something that's been called into another main theme around infrastructure is really critically engaging with disability access. So I think it's pretty widely known and observed. If you don't design for the needs of the most marginalized first, if you don't design for the needs of people who are disabled in public transport systems, you will not make those systems accessible to people who have disabilities. And in a lot of ways, cars have actually become this this technology that's been credited as like a savior, especially for people who are disabled, because they allow you to have a lot more autonomy if you can afford one, but they're not affordable to the majority of people. So I think let's rather, instead of prioritizing cars as this kind of, you know, tool that can save us, rather say that this is not a democratic technology. And that can really come through with disability access and design and public transportation. Intermodal integration is absolutely critical. So you should be able to get on a bus, go to your next route, and then if you need to walk, or you could take a shared bike that's at that next bus depot to get where you're going. So a lot of that has to do with visual and land use planning. Or can I just ask someone to mute? I'm not sure who. Thank you. Yeah, so basically making sure that modes are integrated and connected very seamlessly. I already mentioned this, but prioritizing the deployment of renewable energy to power buses and trains. And then also digitization is really important. I mean, people have a right to know, you know, when the bus that they need to take is going to leave, when the train that they need to take is going to leave, and to be able to rely on them and plan their trips, and also pay for their ticketing on mobile applications. In a lot of places, we've seen massive like think tank capacity and research capacity that has undertaken very robust research and built a lot of knowledge on, you know, the best public transport options in their countries. So we said that these interdisciplinary agendas are super important. And that one of the best ways to do it is through like a national government institute to focus on the key themes that we are putting forth here. But then these should also be available, that knowledge needs to be spread and available across different levels. And there's different ways to do that. So you can have review communities with expertise in this area who are, you know, sitting in different government institutions and sitting on different boards and making sure that what they're approving is also in line with what national government institutes that are focusing on mobilizing this agenda also need. And then through climate crisis planning, you can also dedicate these bridging bodies. Bridging institutions are super important, like I was just saying, but basically institutions that are making sure that across government, different projects that are getting developed, different plans that are being approved, that there's not policy clash between those things, and that we're not financing things that actually have competing priorities. And then a bottom-up national transport just transition strategy that's based on this framework, but also informed by national climate planning and informed by people who are also experiencing climate change right now. So financing this still within the role of government. There's a couple different ways that this can happen, and that there are actually a lot of resources that can be mobilized into this. One potential is mobilizing the Road Accident Fund. It's approximately 176 billion rand a year that's spent on cleaning up crashes just in this country. And then requiring development finance institutions to incorporate the CJC systemic alternatives into their project approvals. So really thinking about how sustainable finance can be mobilized, and how are stipulations for the just transition being made in what they approve. Prioritizing the 72.5 billion rand budget towards mobilizing this policy framework, and then also using funds that are raised from disincentives, especially through taxes on the wealthy and also on the private sector. When it comes to technology innovation and creating climate jobs, there is so much potential for electric technologies that are emerging, and for South Africa to capture those markets. So electric ships, they're still in their infancy, but they are rapidly developing. There's been a lot of development into hydrogen trains, into solar locomotives, into battery locomotives. There is electric buses that are already available, as well as hydrogen buses that are already available. And so there is a lot of potential for that manufacturing to start happening in country, as well as heavy duty equipment. I think this is something that often gets overlooked, but we will need some heavy duty equipment. We might need garbage trucks. We might need these other things. And so there is potential also for those value to be captured. And then there's also There's a lot of construction potential with building eco-mobility infrastructure, with reconstructing the railway infrastructure. There's a lot that has to go into that. And then also through capturing the bicycle economy, there is such, like, I see it every single day in Cape Town. There are just more and more cyclists, it feels like, everywhere all the time. And a lot of them are riding fancy bikes that are made in Europe, but there is a lot of potential for developing bicycles that can be manufactured here in country for recreation and also for commuting. There's a lot of youth unemployment opportunities in bicycle repair. And then, sorry, you'll just have to excuse, it's fitting that the train is going by, but I live by a train station, so you might hear the horn. And also the shared bike and the shared electric bike entrepreneurship. This is something that has exploded in especially the Chinese economy, and that's actually been really captured by young people with both skilled and unskilled skill sets. And then also a lot of zero waste employment through resource reuse, recovery, and redesign, especially when it comes to equipment and manufacturing. On the role of government, last thing here, and then we'll just move on to the last two. There's possibility of exploring more oceans transportation. This is one of the modes. It's actually easier to integrate freight and passenger transport, and it's already happens in a lot of places. And then also just electric ships and ferries. Again, the technology is in their infancy, but the potential is there. When it comes to taxi reform, based off of a lot of research, one of the models that we found that it has a lot of potential is modeled off of what they've done in Kigali. And basically it would involve creating a state cooperative model that's built around different routes in a city and also over longer distances within the country. The government must facilitate tenders for the taxi industry, and how other places have done this, the agreement has basically been that taxi associations provide the capital for the buses, and then the government provides the infrastructure and sets operational standards. And in order for this to work, basically in every single place, it's had to include incentives that benefit taxi associations. They need to be convinced and brought along that they will have stable working conditions and hours, they'll have salaried pay, they'll have healthcare benefits, disability protections, access to financing, and then also that jobs will be available to them. Other jobs besides just driving a bus can also be available to them, such as working in delivery services, and in non-passenger transport, as well as in bus depots and in urban transport systems. And then this has to be digitized and integrated with other modes in ticketing, which that is going to be a challenge in taxi reform, but it's important. Last few things just on the role of communities. Activism has a really big role to play, and just to quickly focus on the Open Streets movement has been very active in Joburg and also in Cape Town, but the theory of change basically rests on that streets are public spaces and cars are not in an equal or democratic use of public space. One car takes up about 80% of road space versus one person on a bike takes up about 3% of road space. So if you just think about it like that, and who can afford a car, and historically who's been able to afford and use and maintain a car, they're not our priority in terms of technology. And then there's also this Bicycle Maros, this African network. They're active in Joburg, they're active in Cape Town, as well as all throughout the African continent. And they push really, really hard for better conditions for cyclists and pedestrians, for safer mobility conditions. And I think engaging with them would be really useful. Why can't I change my slide now? There we go. Lastly, the role of workplaces and sectors. I already covered a lot of what needs to happen in terms of technology, innovation, the economy, but just to reinforce that there's a lot of potential here for also capturing digital infrastructure and developing that infrastructure, software that needs to be developed to handle the real-time monitoring and deployment of public transportation. And then also the transformation of PRASA and Transnet. So how do we get these institutions to work again, so that new life can be breathed into them? And this idea of transforming them into democratic and digital public utilities, with workers and users of the services being given participation rights in decision-making structures. Last few things that also workplaces can facilitate is involving employees and their students, for universities to be involved in this transition through shifting to teleworking approaches. There's lots of ways that you can also, incentivize eco-mobility and public transport approaches, should those alternatives be available to your workers. And then also being involved through a progressive payroll and tax, subsidize these systems and help provide for decommodified transport access. And that these, the transport system should be built on as like part of a trust system, doesn't need to be policed, but people who can pay do pay. Lastly, in private infrastructure, you can really think about, are my spaces walkable? Are they open to pedestrians and cyclists? Is there bike storage here? Who do I prioritize in the space that I have built? Is it cars or is it somebody on a bike? And so really thinking through those things in any infrastructure that you own, or any organizations or infrastructure that your organization owns. One thing that was really important for incentivizing, especially employees who work in jobs where maybe they have to have a lot of equipment with them, is providing storage kind of facilities for these employees so they don't have to take it home every single day. And then lastly, working with local governments on the ground to identify like priority infrastructures, especially parking facilities that can be converted to public transportation infrastructure. Okay, last thing is just to ground that the CJCM really has rejected this EVs for everyone approach, and you can read much more about it in the policy framework, but just for these 5 reasons here, that it has the potential to reinforce fossil fuel dependency, creates unnecessary resource competition, reinforces a low density car-centric culture. It does not offer any pathway to equality and is actually anti-democratic in a lot of ways. And there's also the potential for more job creation in the public transport approach rather than sticking with cars. So that's everything. I hope that you engage with this and poke some holes in it and take it forward to mobilize it.
Thank you, Lexi. And I also just want to mention that Lexi worked at COPAC and is doing a master's in sustainability at Stellenbosch and is a climate justice activist. So I know we've gone over time.